Everyone in the courtroom heard the laughter. It wasn't just the audience, it was her ex-husband, his shark of a lawyer, and even the bailiff snickering at the financial affidavit in her trembling hands. They mocked her worn-out shoes. They ridiculed her $28,000 a year salary. They called her unfit, simply because she wasn't rich. They thought they were witnessing the final destruction of a struggling woman. But they didn't know that inside the battered leather briefcase on the defense table sat a document that would silence the entire room, freeze the judge in his tracks, and turn the hunter into the hunted. This is the story of how Sarah Mitchell let them think they had won only to reveal a secret worth $4 billion. The fluorescent lights inside Courtroom 304 of the Cook County Circuit Court hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. But for Sarah Mitchell, the sound was drowned out by the droning voice of Preston Halloway. Halloway was a man who cost $600 an hour, and he made sure everyone in the room knew it. He wore his bespoke Italian suit like a suit of armor, pacing the floor with the predatory grace of a tiger circling a wounded gazelle. "Your Honor," Halloway boomed, turning his back on Sarah to address Judge Lawrence Kincaid. "We are not here to question Ms. Mitchell's character. We are here to deal with mathematics, and the math is quite frankly depressing." Sarah sat perfectly still at the defendant's table. She kept her hands clasped in her lap to hide the fact that her fingernails were bitten down to the quick. She wore a simple navy blazer she'd found at a consignment shop 3 years ago. It was clean, pressed, and respectable, but next to the glittering cufflinks of her ex-husband Blake Anderson, it looked like a costume. Blake sat behind Halloway, leaning back in his chair, with a smirk that didn't quite touch his eyes. He checked his Rolex, a Submariner that cost more than Sarah's car, and sighed theatrically. He was the VP of sales for a mid-sized tech logistics firm, Nexus Global. To the outside world, he was a success story. To Sarah, he was the man who had spent 6 years making her feel small so he could feel big. "Proceed, Mr. Halloway," Judge Kincaid said, peering over his spectacles. The judge was a tired man who had seen too many divorces and had little patience for poverty. "Thank you, Your Honor." Halloway continued, picking up a piece of paper as if it were a soiled tissue. "We are looking at Ms. Mitchell's financial affidavit. Her reported monthly income as an assistant art instructor at a community center is barely $2,000 after taxes. Her rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs takes up 60% of that." Halloway turned to the gallery, playing to the crowd. 60%. That leaves roughly $800 for food, utilities, insurance, and the child. He let the silence hang. "My client, Mr. Anderson, earns upward of $300,000 annually, not including bonuses and stock options from Nexus Global. He resides in a gated community. He has a dedicated education trust already established. He can provide stability. Ms. Mitchell can barely provide lunch." Blake leaned forward, whispering loudly enough for the microphone to catch it. "I just want what's best for Leo. I don't want him growing up in a place where they have to water down the milk." A ripple of laughter moved through the courtroom. It was quiet, cruel laughter. Sarah felt the heat rise up her neck. It wasn't true. She never watered down the milk. Leo, their 5-year-old son, was happy. He was loved. They made fortresses out of cardboard boxes and painted masterpieces with finger paints. But in this room, love didn't have a currency symbol attached to it, so it didn't count. "Ms. Mitchell," the judge spoke, his voice dry. "Do you have legal representation present? The court notes state you dismissed your public defender." Sarah stood up. Her legs felt heavy, like they were filled with concrete. "Yes, Your Honor. My attorney is running a few minutes late. He had trouble finding parking." Blake snorted. "Probably couldn't afford the garage fees." Holloway chuckled, shaking his head. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a stalling tactic. Ms. Mitchell has clearly realized the hopelessness of her financial standing. We are asking for full custody to be awarded to Mr. Anderson immediately, with supervised visitation for the mother, pending a review of her living conditions." "Supervised?" Sarah blurted out, her voice cracking. "I'm his mother. I've raised him every single day while he was on business trips." "And you did a lovely job," Holloway said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But we are talking about his future now. We are talking about private schools. Equestrian lessons. A life Ms. Mitchell, not a survival strategy." "I object to the characterization that my client is merely surviving," a voice came from the back of the room. The heavy oak doors swung open. The room turned. Entering the court wasn't a shark in a shiny suit. It was an elderly man, perhaps in his late 70s. He wore a tweed suit that looked like it smelled of pipe tobacco and old libraries. He carried a battered leather briefcase that had seen better decades, let alone days. He walked with a cane, but his movement was steady rhythmic. Click. Step. Click. Step. Blake whispered to Holloway. "Is that him? He looks like he wandered out of a nursing home." Holloway smirked. "Let him talk. This will be over in 10 minutes. The old man reached the defense table and nodded to Sarah. "Apologies for the delay, Sarah. The security checkpoint had an issue with my hip replacement." Sarah exhaled a breath she felt she'd been holding for months. "It's okay, Arthur." Arthur P. Jenkins was not a high-powered divorce attorney. He was a contract lawyer who mostly handled estate planning for retirees in Sarah's neighborhood. Blake and Holloway had looked him up weeks ago and laughed. He had no website, no LinkedIn, just a phone number in the yellow pages. "State your name for the record." Judge Kincaid sighed, looking at the clock. "Arthur P. Jenkins, representing Miss Sarah Mitchell." "Mr. Jenkins," the judge said, "we are in the middle of a motion regarding the financial instability of your client. Mr. Holloway has made a compelling argument that Ms. Mitchell is financially incapable of matching the lifestyle the father can provide. Do you have a response regarding her income?" Arthur set his briefcase down on the table. He didn't open it yet. He just patted the leather lid affectionately. "I do, Your Honor." Arthur said, his voice surprisingly deep and resonant like a cello. "But first, I'd like to cross-examine Mr. Anderson regarding his financial affidavit. If we are measuring worth by numbers, we should ensure all the numbers are precise." Holloway waved a hand dismissively. "My client's finances are audited and transparent, but if the old man wants to waste the court's time, let him." Blake stood up, buttoning his jacket, and walked to the witness stand. He winked at Sarah as he passed. It was a wink that said, "Game over." Sarah looked down at her hands. She remembered the day she found the papers in her grandmother's attic. She remembered the phone call to Arthur. She remembered the promise she made to herself. Wait until they show who they really are. They had shown it. Now it was time for the turn. Blake Anderson sat in the witness box, the picture of modern corporate arrogance. He adjusted the microphone, looking at the judge with a "can you believe this" expression. Arthur Jenkins shuffled his papers. He didn't look aggressive. He looked confused, like he was looking for a missing crossword puzzle clue. "Mr. Anderson," Arthur began, peering over his reading glasses. You stated in your deposition that Ms. Mitchell is, and I quote, a financial burden and incapable of understanding complex asset management. Is that correct? It is, Blake said smoothly. Sarah is a great artist. But money. She thinks a savings account is high finance. I tried to explain my stock options to her once and she just stared at me. I see, Arthur said. And because of this lack of sophistication, you handled all the finances during the marriage? Naturally. Someone had to. And you are requesting that Ms. Mitchell pay your legal fees, citing her frivolous defense against your custody motion. She's wasting everyone's time, Blake said, leaning into the mic. I'm trying to save my son from a life of mediocrity. If she has to go into debt to learn that lesson, so be it. Holloway nodded approvingly from his table. Arthur stopped shuffling papers. He paused. The confused old man demeanor evaporated instantly. He straightened his spine. When he looked up, his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and dangerous. Mr. Anderson, Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. Are you familiar with the Global Maritime Logistics Consolidated Merger of 2024? Blake blinked. The question was completely out of left field. Yes, everyone in tech logistics knows it. It was a massive shipping deal. What does that have to do with Sarah's part-time job? And are you aware, Arthur continued, ignoring the jab, that the merger was delayed for 3 days because a majority shareholder had not yet signed off on the transfer of voting rights? Holloway stood up. Objection relevance, Your Honor. Mr. Jenkins is discussing global shipping news. We are here for a custody hearing. I'm establishing the financial landscape, Your Honor, Arthur said calmly. It goes to the heart of Mr. Anderson's claim about who understands finance. Judge Kincaid rubbed his temples. I'll allow it for 2 more minutes, Mr. Jenkins. Get to the point. Arthur turned back to Blake. Mr. Anderson, you work for Nexus Global. Your company was a junior partner in that merger. You received a bonus of $15,000 for your team's role in the integration. Correct? Yes, Blake said, puffing his chest out. I led that integration. 15,000, Arthur mused. A tidy sum. And you used that bonus to put a down payment on your new Porsche, which you listed as a primary asset to prove your stability to this court. It shows I have reliable, disposable income. Right, Arthur said. He walked back to the defense table and placed his hand on the latches of the battered briefcase. Click, click. The sound echoed in the silent room. Mr. Anderson, you mocked Ms. Mitchell for her salary. You mocked her for her lack of sophistication. You claimed she brings nothing to the table. Arthur lifted the lid of the briefcase. He pulled out a single document. It wasn't a thin sheet of paper. It was bound in heavy blue cardstock, stamped with a wax seal that looked older than the courthouse itself. Tell me, Mr. Anderson, Arthur said, walking the document toward the witness stand. In your extensive research into global maritime logistics, did you ever encounter the name the Van der Hoeven Trust? Blake frowned. The color drained slightly from his face. The Van der Hoeven Trust. That's the holding company, the quiet money behind the merger. They own half the shipping lanes in the North Atlantic. Correct, Arthur said. He stopped 3 feet from Blake. And did you know that the Van der Hoeven Trust has a sole beneficiary, a single living heir who holds the voting rights for 51% of the conglomerate? I don't follow. Mr. Holloway, Arthur said, turning to the opposing lawyer. You asked how Ms. Mitchell could afford a brand-name cereal. You asked how she could provide a future for her son. Arthur handed the document to the bailiff. Please give this to the judge. And a copy for Mr. Halloway." The room went deadly silent as the judge took the document. He put on his glasses. He opened the first page. The judge's eyebrows shot up. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at the paper, then at Sarah, then back at the paper. He turned the page. He looked at the signature at the bottom. "Mr. Jenkins," the judge said, his voice trembling slightly. "Is this authenticated?" "Notarized by the High Court of The Hague and the Southern District of New York." "Your Honor," Arthur said. "What is it?" Blake demanded, his voice losing its smooth edge. "What is that?" Arthur turned to Blake, a small, cold smile playing on his lips. "Mr. Anderson, you have been bragging about your $300,000 salary. You have been bullying a woman you thought was a destitute art teacher." Arthur pointed a finger at Sarah, who was now looking up, her eyes clear and dry. "You are looking at Sarah van der Hoven Mitchell. Her grandmother was Eleanor van der Hoven, the matriarch of the Dutch shipping dynasty. When Elena passed away 6 months ago, the trust was unlocked." Halloway snatched the copy of the document from the bailiff. He scanned it frantically. His mouth fell open. This says," Halloway stammered. "It says," Arthur interrupted, "that Ms. Mitchell is the sole beneficiary of the Van der Hoven estate. This includes the shipping lanes, the real estate portfolio in Geneva, and the liquid assets." Arthur leaned in close to Blake. "You mocked her $28,000 salary, but you failed to ask her dividends. As of this morning, the quarterly dividend payment deposited into the trust for Ms. Mitchell was $42 million. The courtroom erupted. Blake stared at Sarah. 40 million quarterly, Arthur corrected. Her total inheritance, conservatively estimated, is valued at $4.2 billion. Sarah finally spoke. She didn't shout. She just leaned into her microphone. "I didn't want Leo to grow up like you, Blake," she said softly. "Obsessed with money, thinking it makes you better than people. So I lived on my salary. I lived small. But you tried to take him away from me because you thought I was poor. You thought you could buy justice." She stood up, and for the first time she looked like the billionaire she was. "You wanted to talk about math. Blake? Let's talk about math. You have a Porsche. I can buy the factory that makes them." Halloway dropped the paper. It fluttered to the floor like a dying bird. But the drama was far from over, because while the money was revealed, the custody battle was still a legal war. And Blake Anderson wasn't the type of man to walk away from $4 billion. He was the type of man to try and steal it. The silence in courtroom 304 was no longer the silence of boredom. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb that had just gone off, but hadn't finished destroying the building. Judge Kincaid sat frozen, the blue-bound document resting in his hands like a holy relic. He looked at the figure 4.2 billion. It was a number that made the earlier arguments about grocery bills and rent checks seem like the bickering of children. "Mr. Jenkins," the judge finally said, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Just to be absolutely clear, you are telling this court that the defendant, the mother, possesses assets that exceed the GDP of some small nations." "That is correct, Your Honor," Arthur replied, returning to his seat. He moved with a new lightness, the weight of the secret finally off his shoulders. Sarah Mitchell, or rather, Sarah van der Hoven, has merely been living within the means of her salary to maintain a grounded upbringing for her son. There is no law against a wealthy woman living simply. The argument that she is financially unfit is now moot. Sarah looked across the aisle. She expected to see defeat. She expected to see Blake Anderson shrinking into his chair, ashamed of his greed. But she didn't see shame. She saw calculation. Blake was staring at her, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting back and forth as if he were re-evaluating an investment portfolio. He wasn't looking at his ex-wife. He was looking at a winning lottery ticket he had thrown in the trash. Preston Holloway, however, was faster. The shark had been stunned for exactly 10 seconds. Now the shark was hungry. "Your Honor," Holloway barked, slamming his hand on the table. The sudden noise made the stenographer jump. "I request an immediate recess. This is an ambush. We have been blindsided by critical financial data that was withheld from discovery." "Withheld," Arthur countered calmly. "Mr. Holloway, you asked for an affidavit of her income. The trust is not income. It is an inheritance kept in a separate vehicle until accessed. Sarah has not accessed a penny of it. Therefore, her affidavit was perfectly accurate. She lives on $28,000 a year. It's material information." Holloway screamed, his face turning a shade of plum. "My client has been negotiating custody and support based on the premise that Ms. Mitchell is destitute. This changes the entire landscape of the divorce." Blake leaned over and whispered frantically into Holloway's ear. He grabbed Holloway's forearm, his knuckles white. Holloway listened, his eyes narrowing. He nodded slowly. A slow, terrifying grin spread across the lawyer's face. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Why are they smiling, Your Honor?" Holloway said, smoothing his tie and lowering his voice to a dangerous, silky tone. "We withdraw our motion for full custody based on financial instability." "Wise," Judge Kincaid grunted. "However," Holloway continued stepping out from behind his table. He walked toward Sarah, not looking at the judge. "We are now filing an emergency motion regarding the equitable distribution of marital assets." Arthur stood up. "Objection. The divorce decree was agreed upon in principle months ago. We are only here for the custody hearing." "Agreed upon in principle," Holloway said, spinning around to face the room. "But not signed, not finalized, and more importantly based on a fraudulent financial disclosure." Holloway turned to the judge. "Your Honor, Ms. Mitchell's grandmother passed away 6 months ago. Is that correct?" Arthur hesitated. "Yes, approximately." "And 6 months ago," Holloway pressed, "Ms. Mitchell and Mr. Anderson were still legally married. They were living in separate houses, yes, but the divorce was not final. In the state of Illinois, inheritance is generally considered separate property." He paused for effect. "Unless," Holloway shouted, pointing a finger at Blake. "Unless there was a reasonable expectation of shared future assets that influenced the financial decisions of the marriage. Furthermore, if the beneficiary commingled any aspect of that potential inheritance with marital funds, the protection is pierced." "She didn't spend a dime," Arthur argued. "There is no commingling, but there is deception," Holloway roared. "Mr. Anderson paid for the mortgage. Mr. Anderson paid for the car. Mr. Anderson paid the debts. All while his wife was sitting on a secret fortune. That is financial infidelity. Your Honor, it is fraud. And because of that fraud, we argue that the prenuptial agreements are void. We argue that the inheritance received while they were legally husband and wife is subject to division." Blake stood up, looking at Sarah with a look of mock betrayal. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling with fake emotion. I worked 80-hour weeks. I missed birthdays. I stressed myself into an ulcer to provide for us. And you? You were a billionaire. You watched me struggle and you didn't help. You let me pay for everything while you sat on a mountain of gold. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Suddenly the man who had mocked her for being poor was playing the victim of her wealth. I didn't tell you, Sarah said, her voice shaking, because I knew this would happen. I knew you'd only love the money, not me. Order. Judge Kincaid banged his gavel. Mr. Holloway, are you suggesting that Mr. Anderson is entitled to a portion of the Vanderhoven estate? Not a portion, Your Honor, Holloway said, buttoning his jacket. Since there was fraud and non-disclosure during the marriage, we are claiming that the assets are communal. We are suing for 50%. The room gasped. 50% of $4 billion. $2 billion. Blake Anderson leaned back in his chair. He looked at Sarah. He mouthed one word. Checkmate. The recess lasted an hour, but to Sarah it felt like a lifetime. She sat in a small consultation room with Arthur. The air conditioner rattled, blowing cold air onto her sweat-dampened skin. Can they do that? Sarah asked, pacing the small room. Arthur, tell me the truth. Can they take half? Arthur sat at the small metal table, polishing his glasses. He looked older than he had in the courtroom. The energy of the reveal had faded, replaced by the grim reality of procedural law. In a perfect world. No, Arthur said heavily. Inheritance is separate property. It belongs to you, not the marriage. That's the law. But, Sarah pressed, I hear a but in your voice. But Holloway is good. He's dirty, but he's good, Arthur admitted. He's going to argue equitable estoppel. He's going to say that by letting Blake pay for everything, while you had access to these funds, you effectively used his money to protect your own capital. He'll argue that you treated the marriage as a business transaction, where you defrauded the partner. Arthur sighed. If the judge buys the argument that your non-disclosure caused Blake financial harm, that he wouldn't have worked so hard or spent so much if he had known the judge could order a settlement. Maybe not 50%. But even 10% is $400 million. And worse. Worse, if the assets are frozen pending litigation, Arthur said, looking her in the eye. Holloway will petition for Blake to have temporary custody of Leo. He'll argue that you are currently under investigation for financial fraud and perjury. Sarah slammed her hand against the wall. He doesn't want Leo. He wants the leverage. He'll trade Leo for a payout. Exactly, Arthur said. That is his play. The door opened. The bailiff poked his head in. Judge is ready. Walking back into the courtroom felt different. Before, Sarah was the underdog. Now she was the target. The atmosphere had shifted from pity to envy. Everyone looked at her, the bailiff, the clerk, the random people in the gallery. They weren't seeing a mother anymore. They were seeing walking money. Judge Kincaid looked stern. He had clearly spent the recess reading case law. Please be seated, the judge said. I have reviewed the emergency motion filed by Mr. Holloway. Holloway stood looking confident. He had spent the recess giving an interview on the courthouse steps, spinning the story of the poor, deceived husband. Mr. Jenkins, the judge addressed Arthur, the timeline is problematic for your client. The date of death for Elena Vanderhoven was November the 12th. The initial filing for divorce was November the 14th. 2 days later. A coincidence, Your Honor, Arthur said. Ms. Mitchell was grieving. She wasn't thinking about filing papers. Or, Holloway interjected. She waited until the trust was secure, then filed for divorce, hoping to hide the asset before the discovery phase. It looks like premeditated shielding of marital assets. Ms. Mitchell, the judge asked Sarah directly, did you use any marital funds to facilitate the transfer of this inheritance? Did you use the family car to drive to the lawyer? Did you use the family phone plan to call the executors? Sarah froze. I drove my car, which is in Blake's name because his credit was better. I used my phone on the family plan. Holloway threw his hands up. There it is. Marital resources used to secure the asset that opens the door. Your Honor. It was a ridiculous technicality. Using a phone plan to call a lawyer shouldn't cost a woman $2 billion. But in high-stakes divorce court, ridiculous technicalities were weapons of mass destruction. Your Honor. Blake spoke up, his voice somber. I don't want to hurt Sarah. I really don't. But I feel used. I feel like my entire marriage was a lie. If she could hide $4 billion, what else was she hiding? Was she faithful? Was she? Objection! Arthur roared, banging his cane on the floor. Character assassination. Sustained, the judge said, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt was planted. I am inclined, Judge Kincaid said slowly, to grant a temporary freeze on the assets of the Vander Hoven Trust, pending a forensic audit of the marriage finances. Holloway pumped his fist. Blake smirked. And, the judge continued, regarding custody. Sarah stopped breathing. Given the complex nature of the impending litigation and the volatility this will introduce into Ms. Mitchell's life, I am concerned about the stability of the home environment. Your Honor, Holloway said quickly. Mr. Anderson is ready to take Leo immediately. His home is stable. No press. No auditors knocking on the door. No, Sarah screamed. She couldn't help it. You can't take him. He's my son. Ms. Mitchell, sit down, the bailiff warned, moving toward her. I am ruling, Judge Kincaid said, raising his gavel. The temporary primary custody is awarded to Mr. Anderson effective immediately. Ms. Mitchell will have weekend visitation rights. Bang! The gavel sounded like a gunshot. Sarah felt her knees give way. She collapsed into her chair, gasping for air. They had done it. They had turned her victory into a nightmare. They had taken her money, frozen it so she couldn't use it to fight them, and taken her son. Blake stood up and walked over to Sarah's table. He leaned down close to her ear. You should have just told me, Sarah. He whispered, his voice cold and dead. We could have been a power couple. Now I'm going to take half your money, and I'm going to raise our son to hate you. I'm going to buy him everything you couldn't, and by the time he's 10, he won't even remember your name. He straightened up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the courtroom like a king. Arthur Jenkins sat motionless. He stared at the closed doors. Arthur, Sarah sobbed, grabbing his sleeve. Do something, you said. You said the inheritance was safe. Arthur turned to her. His eyes were no longer kind. They were furious. But not at her. I said the inheritance was safe, Sarah. And it is. Arthur opened his briefcase again. He pulled out a second document. It was smaller, handwritten on yellow legal paper. Holloway made a mistake, Arthur murmured. A classic, arrogant mistake. He assumed the Vander Hoven Trust was the only card we had. What? Sarah wiped her eyes. What do you mean? He argued that because the grandmother died on November the 12th, the money is marital property. Arthur said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But he forgot to ask one very specific question. He forgot to ask, which grandmother? Sarah stared at him. I only have one grandmother. Elena. No. Arthur smiled, and it was a terrifying smile. You had a step-grandmother, Eleanor's partner, a woman named Martha, and Martha didn't die 6 months ago. Arthur tapped the yellow paper. She died 30 years ago, and she left a dormant account, an account that predates your marriage, predates your birth, an account that Holloway doesn't know exists because it's not in the trust. It's in a private holding in the Cayman Islands. Arthur stood up. Let him take Leo for tonight. Let him think he's won. Because tomorrow morning we aren't going to fight him in family court. Where are we going? Sarah asked. We are going to federal court, Arthur said. Because what Blake Anderson did with Nexus Global during that merger, the one I asked him about. That wasn't just a bonus he received. Arthur looked at the door where Blake had exited. I have proof that Blake committed insider trading to buy that Porsche. And tomorrow, we aren't suing for custody. We are sending the FBI to his front door. The champagne in Blake Anderson's glass cost $300 a bottle. It tasted like victory. It was 9:00 p.m., 6 hours after the gavel had fallen in Judge Kincaid's courtroom. Blake was pacing the marble floors of his living room in the exclusive Highland Estates gated community. Outside, the autumn wind whipped against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside the fire was roaring and the mood was electric. Preston Holloway sat on the Italian leather sofa loosening his tie. He looked exhausted, but smug. You have to admit, Blake. Holloway chuckled, swirling his drink. The financial infidelity angle was genius. I saw the blood drain out of Jenkins' face. The old man didn't know what hit him. He's a dinosaur, Blake scoffed, admiring his reflection in the darkened window. And she's just a deer in headlights. She honestly thought she could walk in there, wave a piece of paper, and I'd just roll over. She forgot who I am. Well, Holloway cautioned, don't get too comfortable. We still have to win the forensic audit. If she really has $4 billion, she can hire an army of lawyers eventually. We need to force a settlement fast. Threaten to drag the custody battle out for years. She'll pay half just to get the kid back. Speaking of the kid, Blake muttered, glancing toward the hallway. Is he asleep? The nanny put him down an hour ago, Holloway said. He was crying for his mom. Kind of a buzzkill. He'll get over it, Blake said, waving his hand dismissively. Once I buy him that pony or whatever it is kids like, he'll forget all about Sarah and her watercolor paints. Blake walked to the wet bar to refill his glass. He felt invincible. He had the sun, he had the house, and soon he would have a payout that would put him in the history books. To the Van der Hoeven fortune, Blake toasted, raising his glass high. To 50%. Holloway grinned, clinking his glass against Blake's. Crash. The sound didn't come from the glasses. It came from the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of a heavy battering ram, splintering solid oak. Before Blake could even process the noise, the foyer exploded with movement. Flashlights cut through the dim mood lighting of the living room, blindingly bright. Heavy boots thundered on the marble. Federal agents, hands in the air. Nobody move. Blake dropped his glass. It shattered, spraying $300 champagne onto his shoes. What the hell? Blake screamed, shielding his eyes. This is private property. Holloway, do something. Holloway had already done something. He had thrown himself onto the floor, hands laced behind his head, instinct taking over. He knew exactly what this was. A dozen figures in tactical gear swarmed the room. The letters FBI were emblazoned in yellow on their armored vests. "Blake Anderson," a voice boomed. A man in a windbreaker stepped through the tactical team. He was holding a warrant. "I am Special Agent Miller, FBI Financial Crimes Division. You are under arrest." "Arrest?" Blake stammered, his voice jumping an octave. "For what I won custody." "This is a mistake. My ex-wife sent you, didn't she?" "She's crazy." Agent Miller didn't smile. He walked up to Blake, grabbed his wrist and spun him around. The handcuffs clicked, cold, tight, and final. "We aren't here for a domestic dispute, Mr. Anderson. We are here regarding the global maritime logistics merger." Blake froze. The air left his lungs. "You are being charged with 3 counts of securities fraud, 2 counts of insider trading, and 1 count of wire fraud." Miller reciting the rights as he marched Blake towards the door. "Holloway!" Blake screamed, looking back at his lawyer. "Represent me. Fix this." Holloway was still on the floor. He looked up, his face pale. He saw the specific agents securing Blake's laptop and phone. He saw the seriousness of the charge. I practice family law." "Blake," Holloway stammered, distancing himself instantly. "I don't do federal criminal defense." "You coward!" Blake shrieked as he was dragged out into the cool night air. The perfectly manicured lawn of Highland Estates was lit up by red and blue strobes. Neighbors were coming out onto their porches in their bathrobes, watching the VP of sales being stuffed into the back of a black SUV. But the most devastating moment for Blake wasn't the handcuffs. It wasn't the neighbors watching. It was seeing who was standing at the edge of his driveway next to a silver sedan. It was Arthur Jenkins. The old man was leaning on his cane, watching the scene with a grim, satisfied expression. Beside him stood a woman from Child Protective Services. As the agent secured the house, the CPS worker went inside. Minutes later, she emerged carrying a sleepy, confused Leo, wrapped in a blanket. "Daddy." Leo rubbed his eyes, looking at the police lights. "It's okay, Leo," Arthur said, stepping forward. His voice was gentle, a stark contrast to the chaos. "Your dad has to go away for a while, but your mum is waiting for you." Blake slammed his face against the window of the SUV, screaming, but the soundproof glass swallowed his rage. He watched as Arthur Jenkins opened the car door for Leo, safe and calm. The predator had become the prey, and the hunter was a man with a cane and a dormant account from 1995. The interrogation room inside the federal building in downtown Chicago was designed to strip a man of his soul layer by layer. It was a cold, windowless box painted a shade of beige that felt like it had been harvested from a nightmare. The air was recycled and stale, smelling faintly of floor wax and old coffee that had been burned on the pot hours ago. Blake Anderson sat at the metal table, his hands clasping and unclasping in a rhythm of pure anxiety. They had taken his belt. They had taken his shoelaces. They had taken his phone, his wallet, and the platinum Rolex Submariner that he used to define his self-worth. Without the props of his success, Blake looked smaller. He looked like exactly what he was, a man whose luck had finally run dry. He had been sitting there for 3 hours. Every time the ventilation system rattled, his head snapped up, expecting the door to open. He rehearsed his speech in his mind. He would threaten to sue. He would demand to speak to the director. He would charm his way out of this, just like he had charmed his way into boardrooms and country clubs. "It's just a misunderstanding," he told himself, sweat prickling his hairline. "Holloway will fix this. Holloway always fixes this." The heavy steel door buzzed. The sound was electric and harsh, vibrating through the table. Blake straightened his spine, trying to summon the ghost of his corporate arrogance. "It's about time," he muttered, preparing to unleash a tirade. The door swung open. Special Agent Miller walked in first. He was a man made of sharp angles and silence, holding a thick manila file under his arm. But it wasn't Miller who made Blake's blood turn to ice. It was the man following him, Arthur Jenkins. The old lawyer walked in with the slow, deliberate pace of a funeral procession. He didn't look like a man who had been up all night. He looked fresh, alert, and terrifyingly calm. He leaned his cane against the wall and stood in the shadows, his eyes fixed on Blake. "What is he doing here?" Blake demanded, his voice cracking on the first syllable. He pointed a shaking finger at Arthur. "That's my wife's divorce lawyer. This is a conflict of interest. I want my attorney. Where is Preston Halloway?" Agent Miller didn't answer immediately. He pulled out a metal chair, the legs screeching against the linoleum floor, and sat down opposite Blake. He placed the file on the table, aligning the edges with geometric precision. "Your attorney isn't coming, Mr. Anderson," Miller said. His voice was flat, devoid of sympathy. "What do you mean he's not coming?" "I pay him $600 an hour. Mr. Halloway has formally recused himself from your defense," Miller explained, opening the file. "In fact, as we speak, Mr. Halloway is in an interview room down the hall with the Bar Association and the U.S. Attorney's Office. He is currently negotiating a plea deal to retain his license to practice law." Blake blinked, his mouth falling open. He's talking. He is singing," Miller corrected. He was quite eager to explain that he had no knowledge of your insider trading activities. He claims he was merely a pawn in your deception. He's throwing you to the wolves, Blake, to save his own skin. The realization hit Blake like a physical blow. The alliance was dead. The shark had eaten the other shark. "I didn't do anything," Blake stammered, leaning back as if trying to put distance between himself and the file. "I'm a VP of sales. I don't look at trade logs. This is a witch hunt because my ex-wife is bitter." "Sit down," Miller ordered. It wasn't a request. Blake slumped back into the chair. "Let's talk about Nexus Global and the Global Maritime Logistics merger," Miller said. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the file and slid it across the table. It was a printout of a digital trade log. The numbers were highlighted in neon yellow. "On May 14th at 10:42 a.m., your personal trading account executed a purchase order for 10,000 call options on Global Maritime Logistics," Miller recited. "At that specific moment, the stock was trading flat. There was no news, no rumors, just a quiet Tuesday morning." Miller tapped the paper. 3 minutes later at 10:45 a.m., the merger was announced on the wire. The stock jumped 40% in 10 minutes. You cashed out by lunch. You netted a profit of exactly $312,000. "I got lucky," Blake said, sweat now running openly down his temples. "I follow the market. I had a gut feeling. Is it a crime to have good instincts?" "A gut feeling." Miller repeated, his tone dry. "That's what you're going with?" "Yes, it was a hunch." "Interesting," Miller said. He reached into the file again. "Because we pulled your phone records. You deleted the texts, of course. But you forget that nothing is ever really deleted when the feds are involved." He slid a second piece of paper across the table. It was a transcript of a text message conversation. "At 10:40 a.m., 2 minutes before you bought the stock, you received a message from a number registered to a Greg Salter. Greg was your fraternity brother, wasn't he? He currently works as a junior analyst at the regulatory firm that approved the merger." Miller leaned in, reading the text aloud. Green light is on. Ink is dry. Buy now, buy heavy. Dinner is on you. The silence in the room was deafening. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to drill into Blake's skull. We have Greg in the next room, Miller whispered. Greg is very scared, and scared people are very talkative. He's already admitted to tipping you off. Blake put his head in his hands. The room was spinning. The Porsche, the gated community, the tailored suits, it was all dissolving into smoke. Insider trading carries a maximum sentence of 20 years per count, Blake, Miller said, leaning back. Plus fines, plus restitution. And since you used the proceeds of a federal crime to secure a mortgage across state lines, we've tacked on wire fraud. You are looking at a very, very long time in a very small cell. Blake looked up. His eyes rimmed with red. It was just a bonus. Everyone does it. Why are you destroying my life over one trade? Not everyone mocks the mother of their child for being poor while committing felonies to pretend they are rich. A voice spoke from the corner. Blake snapped his head toward the shadows. Arthur Jenkins stepped into the light. You set me up. Blake hissed, his fear momentarily replaced by venom. That day in court, when you asked me about the merger, you weren't establishing my finances. You were laying a trap. I asked you if you were the lead on the integration. Arthur corrected his voice, calm and melodic. I needed you to confirm under oath on the public record that you had intimate knowledge of the company's timeline. You swore you did. You tied yourself to the crime scene, Mr. Anderson. I didn't dig your grave. I just handed you the shovel. Blake stared at the old man. He realized now that Arthur Jenkins wasn't just a dusty estate lawyer. He was a grand master who had been playing 5 moves ahead while Blake was still reading the instructions. Agent Miller cleared his throat. Here is the situation, Blake. The federal case is airtight. You are going to prison. The only question is for how long. And more importantly, where? Miller gestured to Arthur. Mr. Jenkins here has a proposition regarding the pending state charges. State charges, Blake whispered. What state charges? Arthur stepped forward, placing his hands on the back of the empty chair next to Miller. Perjury, Arthur listed, counting on his fingers. Fraud upon the court, falsifying financial affidavits, and attempted extortion of a minor for financial gain. I have the paperwork drafted. I can file these charges with the Cook County District Attorney tomorrow morning. Arthur leaned in close. If I file those charges, Blake, you won't go to federal prison. Not yet. You will sit in the Cook County Jail holding a waiting trial for the next 3 years. Then you will serve state time. And only then will you be transferred to federal custody. You'll be 70 years old before you see a golf course again. Blake felt like he couldn't breathe. What do you want? Arthur reached into the inside pocket of his tweed jacket. He pulled out a single document. It wasn't bound in blue cardstock. It was simple white paper. I want you to sign this. Blake looked at the bold heading at the top of the page, Voluntary Relinquishment of Parental Rights. You want me to give up Leo? Blake choked out. He's my son. Is he? Arthur asked, his voice suddenly hard as iron. Or is he just another asset? Something to be leveraged? You were willing to trade his happiness for a payout. Blake, you were willing to take him from a loving mother just to hurt her. I can't just sign him away. If you sign, Arthur continued, ignoring the plea, Sarah will decline to press the state charges. You will deal only with Agent Miller here. You cooperate with the feds. You give up Holloway. You plead guilty. Maybe with good behavior you're out in 8 years. You can restart your life. Alone. Arthur slid a pen across the table. It clicked against the metal surface. But Leo is done with you. He deserves a parent who doesn't view him as a bargaining chip. Blake looked at the pen. Then he looked at his reflection in the one-way mirror. He saw a man who had lost everything. He thought about the county jail, the violence, the noise, the decades of lost time. He thought about the $4 billion he had almost touched. He realized with a sickening jolt that he never really cared about the boy. He cared about winning, and he had lost. Does she hate me? Blake asked, his voice barely a whisper. He looked up at Arthur, looking for absolution. Arthur didn't give him any. She doesn't think about you at all, Blake, Arthur said coldly. She's busy being a mother. Blake picked up the pen. His hand shook violently. He pressed the tip to the paper. Scritch. Scratch. He signed his name. It was a messy, defeated scrawl. Arthur snatched the paper away the second the pen lifted. He checked the signature, nodded once to Agent Miller, and turned his back on Blake Anderson forever. The lobby. 30 minutes later, Arthur Jenkins walked out of the elevators and into the expansive lobby of the Federal Building. The morning sun was just beginning to stream through the high glass windows, cutting through the dust motes dancing in the air. Sarah Mitchell, Sarah van der Hoven, was sitting on a wooden bench near the security checkpoint. She wasn't wearing designer clothes. She was still in her navy blazer, looking tired with dark circles under her eyes. But she held herself differently now. The hunch of poverty was gone. Curled up in her lap, wrapped in a blanket provided by CPS, was Leo. He was fast asleep, his thumb near his mouth clutching the lapel of his mother's jacket as if it were a lifeline. Arthur walked over slowly. The click of his cane on the terrazzo floor made Sarah look up. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of hope and terror. Arthur sat down next to her. He didn't speak for a long moment. He just let the peace of the morning settle over them. "Is it done?" Sarah whispered, afraid to wake the boy. Arthur reached into his pocket and tapped the folded paper. "It's done." He signed. Sole legal and physical custody. No visitation. He has no claim on you and no claim on Leo. Ever again. Sarah closed her eyes. Her shoulders shook, and a single tear tracked through the smudge of makeup on her cheek. She exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for 6 years. "He's going to prison?" she asked softly. "For the insider trading, yes," Arthur said. "For a significant amount of time." Sarah looked down at her son, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "I didn't want this, Arthur. I didn't want to destroy him. I just wanted him to leave us alone." "You didn't destroy him, Sarah," Arthur said gently. "Greed is a heavy weight. Some people try to carry too much of it, and they drown. You tried to throw him a lifeline. He chose to swim deeper." "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, looking out at the busy street. "The press. They're going to find out about the money. Holloway knows. Blake knows. It's going to be a circus." Arthur chuckled, a warm, raspy sound. "Mr. Holloway is currently trying to avoid federal indictment himself. He won't be leaking anything to the press. And as for the money, the trust has resources. We can move you. Tonight. Somewhere quiet. Switzerland. The Hamptons. Somewhere you can disappear." Sarah adjusted Leo in her arms. She felt the warmth of his small body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. She looked at the city outside the city, where she had struggled, where she had counted coupons, where she had fought for every inch of her life. "I don't want to run Arthur," she said, her voice finding a new strength. "I haven't done anything wrong. This is my money. This is my son. And this is my life." She stood up, lifting Leo effortlessly. She looked like a billionaire. She looked like a warrior. "I think I'm going to stay right here," Sarah said, a small smile touching her lips. "I drove past the old community center last week. They're closing it down due to lack of funding." She looked at Arthur. "I think I'll buy it. I'll turn it into a real art school. For kids who can't afford lessons. For kids like Leo." Arthur smiled, pushing himself up on his cane. He tipped his invisible hat to her. "A fine investment, Ms. van der Hoven," he said. "A very fine investment indeed." Sarah Mitchell walked into that courtroom, a victim mocked for the few dollars in her pocket. She walked out a billionaire, not because of the money in her bank account, but because she knew the true value of things. Blake Anderson thought wealth was a weapon to hurt people, and in the end, it was the weapon that destroyed him. It's a powerful reminder. Never judge someone by their shoes, because you never know where they've walked or what they're carrying in their briefcase. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And let us know in the comments, what would you do if you found out your ex was secretly a billionaire? See you in the next video. Her life was a fairy tale written in the ink of his billion-dollar fortune. A penthouse overlooking Central Park, a wardrobe filled with haute couture, and a baby on the way with the man she adored. But one stray email, a confirmation for a romantic getaway to St. Bart's with a name that wasn't hers, shattered the illusion. This isn't just a story about infidelity. It's the story of the ultimate betrayal, a takedown orchestrated with a single, devastating phone call from an airport terminal. It's about how a woman pushed to the edge, crossed an ocean, not to escape, but to build an empire of her own. Amelia Redmond believed her life was perfect, meticulously curated, like the modern art that adorned the walls of her Fifth Avenue penthouse. At 29, she was the graceful, intelligent wife of Jonathan Davenport, the charismatic founder of Davenport Capital, a private equity firm that devoured and restructured companies with surgical precision. Theirs was a New York City romance for the modern age, a whirlwind courtship, a lavish wedding featured in Vogue, and now the final perfect piece, a baby, their son due in 5 months. The city glittered below their floor-to-ceiling windows, a constant humming reminder of Jonathan's success. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of custom-tailored suits, marathon conference calls, and last-minute flights to London or Hong Kong. Amelia had once been a promising junior architect at a competitive firm, but she'd happily traded her blueprints for baby books, her hard hat for the soft responsibilities of a society wife. She managed their homes, planned their charity galas, and provided a serene, beautiful sanctuary for her husband to return to after his corporate battles. She loved him deeply and without reservation. She saw his ambition not as ruthlessness, but as drive. His frequent absences not as neglect, but as the price of their extraordinary life. This particular Tuesday began like any other. Jonathan had left before dawn for a critical off-site meeting in Boston. He'd kissed her forehead, his lips cool, his scent of expensive cologne and ambition already lingering in the air. "I'll be back late tomorrow, Angel," he'd murmured against her hair. "Take it easy. Think about names." Amelia spent the morning in the nursery, a room painted in a soft, ethereal grey. She ran her hand over the polished wood of the crib, a gentle smile playing on her lips as she felt the familiar flutter of life inside her. It was a kick stronger this time. "Hello in there, little one," she whispered. "Daddy will be home soon." In the afternoon, she decided to get a head start on planning their annual baby moon. Jonathan had promised her a week anywhere in the world before the baby arrived. She imagined the Amalfi Coast, the two of them disconnected from the world, his hand resting on her swollen belly. She opened his personal laptop, which he'd uncharacteristically left on his marble-topped desk. They shared everything he'd always said. Passwords were a mere formality. She was searching for flight availabilities to Italy when a new email popped into his inbox. The sender was the Chevalier Hotel Concierge. The subject line read, "Confirmation Presidential Suite St. Bart's." Curiosity piqued Amelia, clicked it open. Perhaps he was surprising her. Her heart gave a little skip of excitement. The email was brief and professional. "Dear Mr. Davenport, this email confirms your reservation for the presidential suite from August 15th to August 22nd. We have noted your request for a chilled bottle of Dom Perignon Rosé upon arrival, and have scheduled the private yacht excursion for the 17th. We have also received the supplemental itinerary from your associate. We look forward to welcoming you and Ms. Dubois. Sincerely, Jean-Pierre, Head Concierge, the Chevalier Hotel St. Bart's." Amelia read the last line again. And Miss Dubois. Her blood ran cold. Miss Dubois. Who was Miss Dubois? It had to be a mistake. A business associate, perhaps. But a presidential suite. Dom Perignon Rosé. A private yacht. Her mind raced, trying to form a logical, innocent explanation. Maybe Miss Dubois was a client. A very, very important client. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She navigated to his sent folder, her fingers trembling slightly. She typed Dubois into the search bar. One result appeared. An email sent 2 weeks ago to an address she didn't recognize, Dubois@viridianglobal.com. The subject was, "Our Trip." Her breath hitched. She clicked it open. Sophia. It's all booked. The Chevalier Presidential Suite. August 15th, 22. Cleared my entire schedule. This time, no interruptions. J. The screen blurred. The glittering city outside seemed to mock her, a cold, indifferent witness to the sudden collapse of her world. The baby kicked again, a sharp, insistent reminder of the life intertwined with this lie. There was no client. There was no mistake. Jonathan wasn't in Boston for an off-site meeting. He was planning a romantic getaway with another woman. This perfect life, this gilded pegu she had so happily inhabited, was built on a foundation of deceit. And the walls were closing in. The initial shock was a physical blow, leaving Amelia breathless and dizzy. She stumbled back from the desk, one hand protectively on her belly, the other pressed against her mouth to stifle a sob. The penthouse, once a symbol of her happiness, suddenly felt vast, cold, and alien. The art on the walls seemed to jeer at her, the silence amplifying the frantic beating of her heart. For an hour she paced the length of the living room, a storm of denial, rage, and profound sadness warring within her. It's a misunderstanding. There's an explanation. He would never do this to me. Not now. But the cold, hard text of the email was undeniable. Miss Dubois. Sophia Dubois. The name echoed in her mind. Who was she? The question became an obsession, a singular focus that cut through the fog of her pain. The naive, trusting wife began to recede, replaced by a woman with a chillingly clear objective. She needed the truth. All of it. Her background as an architect had trained her to be meticulous, to see the structural integrity or weakness in any design. Now she would apply that same analytical precision to the architecture of her husband's betrayal. She started with the email address dubois@viridianglobal.com. A quick search for Viridian Global brought up the website of a rival private equity firm, a notoriously aggressive player in the market. She navigated to their Our Team page, and there she was, Sophia Dubois, Vice President of Acquisitions. The photo was a gut punch. Sophia was stunning in a sharp, intimidating way. She had sleek, dark hair, cut into a severe bob, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that was more of a smirk. She exuded a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She was the kind of woman who didn't just enter a boardroom, she conquered it. The bio listed her accomplishments: an MBA from Wharton, a series of high-profile hostile takeovers, a reputation for being a closer. She was Jonathan's female counterpart, his equal in ambition, and Amelia now realized his partner in deception. The professional mask fell away as Amelia dove deeper. A few more targeted searches led her to Sophia's Instagram profile. It was private, but the profile picture was a small, high-resolution circle. It showed Sophia on a sailboat, laughing, her head tilted back. The man beside her, his arm slung casually around her shoulder, was cut off by the frame. But Amelia didn't need to see his face. She recognized the watch on his wrist. A Patek Philippe Calatrava, the very one she had given Jonathan for their second anniversary. A wave of nausea washed over her. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. The baby moon he'd promised her. The yacht excursion in St. Bart's. It was all for her. The next few hours were a blur of digital archaeology. Armed with the knowledge that their lives were not private, Amelia logged into their shared credit card account. She'd always left the finances to him, trusting him implicitly. Now she scrolled through months of statements, her heart sinking with every line item. There were so many red flags, so many clues she had blissfully ignored. A charge from Le Jardin restaurant in Paris on a date he was supposed to be in Frankfurt for a banking conference. A hefty bill from the Gentry, an exclusive members-only club in Soho, on nights he claimed to be working late. And then the most damning of all, a charge from 6 weeks ago. Cartier, for thousands of dollars. An amount far too small for a watch, but just right for a piece of signature jewelry. He hadn't given her any jewelry. She remembered that week clearly. He'd been distant, stressed about a deal he was trying to close with Viridian Global. He had mentioned a ruthless VP named Sophia Dubois, who was driving a hard bargain. He'd framed it as a professional battle. Now she saw it for what it was, a cover story. He wasn't just competing with Sophia, he was sleeping with her. The Cartier purchase was likely a gift to celebrate the closing of their deal. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place when she accessed their phone records, a service she had set up years ago for tax purposes and had long forgotten about. She filtered for the number associated with Sophia's work email. The logs were a chronicle of their affair. Hundreds of calls and texts, late-night calls that lasted for hours, flurries of texts during the day. A call at 2 a.m. just last week, when he'd told Amelia he was on a conference call with his team in Asia. The lies were so audacious, so complete, that she almost felt a detached sense of admiration for their sheer gall. He had built a second life in the shadows of their marriage, and she had been its unwitting, happy caretaker. as dusk fell, casting long shadows across the opulent room. Amelia sat in the silence, the damning evidence glowing on the laptop screen before her. The pain was no longer a hot, frantic storm, but a cold, heavy certainty. The man she loved didn't exist. He was a phantom, a carefully constructed role played by a stranger. Her phone buzzed, a text from Jonathan. Just landed in Boston. Crazy day. Thinking of you and my little guy. Love you. The casual intimacy of the message, the blatant, effortless lie, was what finally broke her. The tears came, then hot and silent. They weren't tears of a heartbroken wife anymore. They were tears of rage. For her lost love, for her stolen future, for the child who would be born into this mess. As she cried, a new feeling began to crystallize in the pit of her stomach, hard and sharp as a diamond resolve. He would not get away with this. She would not let him come home and lie to her face, manipulate her with his charm, and beg for a forgiveness he didn't deserve. She would not be the victim in this story. She would be the reckoning. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in controlled fury. Amelia moved through the penthouse like a ghost, her every action deliberate and precise. The grief was still there, a raw, gaping wound in her chest, but it was now insulated by a thick layer of ice. She packed. Not everything, just the essentials. Her passport, personal documents, a few cherished items from her life before Jonathan, and the prenatal vitamins that sat on her nightstand. She methodically transferred half of the money from their joint checking account into her personal one, a safety net she'd barely touched since their wedding. She knew it wasn't much compared to his vast wealth, but it was a start. It was her escape fund. She called Chloe her best friend since college, a sharp-witted journalist who lived in Brooklyn and had always been slightly wary of Jonathan's polished perfection. "Mia, you okay? You sound strange." "I need a favor," Amelia said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. "A big one. Can you book me a one-way ticket to Lisbon, Portugal for tonight? The latest flight possible." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "Lisbon? What's going on? Is it Jonathan? Is the baby okay?" "The baby is fine," Amelia said, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. "Jonathan is not. I'll explain everything later. Can you just do it for me?" "Please, Chloe. Don't use any of our shared cards. Use yours. I'll pay you back tonight." Chloe, sensing the urgency and the steel in her friend's tone, didn't argue. "Okay. Lisbon it is. I'm sending the confirmation to your personal email now. Mia, be careful." "I will be," Amelia replied. "I also need the name of a shark, the best, most ruthless divorce attorney in New York." Chloe gave her a name, Brenda Walsh, a woman known for leaving financial titans quaking in their boots. Amelia's second call was to Ms. Walsh's office, scheduling an emergency consultation for the following afternoon, knowing she would be taking the call from another continent. Her plan was audacious, born of pain, and a desperate need to reclaim her own narrative. She would not give him the satisfaction of a tearful face-to-face confrontation. She would not allow him to deploy his well-honed weapons of charm, gaslighting, and false promises. He conducted his life via phone calls and remote commands, closing deals and ruining lives from a distance. She would end their marriage the same way. She would treat it like one of his hostile takeovers, swift, brutal, and from a position of unexpected power. She found out through a quick search that Jonathan wasn't just in a meeting in Boston. He was the keynote speaker at the New England Tech Investment Summit. His speech was scheduled for 8 p.m. That would be her moment. At 7:45 p.m. Eastern Time, Amelia was sitting in a sterile, anonymous chair at a gate in JFK's International Terminal. The flight to Lisbon was boarding in an hour. Around her, people bustled with excitement, embarking on vacations and adventures. For Amelia, this was an exodus. She pulled out her phone, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a deep, steadying breath, channeling every ounce of betrayal into a cold, clear focus. She dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice slightly breathless background noise echoing around him. Angel. Hey, I was just about to go on stage. Can I call you right back? No. Amelia said, her voice level and calm, a chilling counterpoint to the chaos in her chest. You'll want to take this call. The tone of her voice must have alerted him. The background noise quieted as he presumably stepped away. Mia. What is it? Is everything all right? The baby. The baby is the only thing that's all right, she said. I know, Jonathan. A beat of silence. No, what, honey, you're not making any sense. I'm about to speak in front of 1,000 people. I know about Sophia Dubois, she stated, letting the name hang in the air between them. I know about St. Bart's, the yacht, the Cartier gift. I know about the late-night calls you said were with Asia and the business dinners at Le Jardin. I know everything. The silence on the other end was profound. She could picture him perfectly standing backstage, his handsome face paling the charming facade, crumbling to reveal the panicked man beneath. Amelia, listen to me. He started, his voice dropping to a low, placating murmur. It's not what you think. It's complicated. She's a colleague and things got blurred. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake. Let me come home. We can talk about this. I love you. I love our family. It was the exact script she had anticipated, and hearing it filled her not with pain, but with a pure, clarifying rage. No, Jonathan. We will not talk about this. There is nothing left to say, she said, her voice as sharp as glass. You don't love our family. You love the idea of it. You love the picture of perfection it provides. But you desecrated it. While I was at home carrying your son, you were building a separate life with her. Mia, please don't do this over the phone. He pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. Don't throw away everything we have. Let me fix this. There's nothing to fix, she said, the finality of her own words empowering her. I'm at JFK. JFK. What are you doing there? Are you going somewhere? I've already gone, she replied. She looked at the departure board. Flight 117 to Lisbon. Boarding. By the time you get back to New York, the penthouse will be empty. I've taken what I need. My lawyer, Brenda Walsh, will be in touch with yours tomorrow to begin divorce proceedings. I will be filing for full custody. Custody lawyer Amelia, you can't be serious, he shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and fury. You can't just leave. You can't take my son. He's my son too, she countered, standing up and walking towards the boarding gate. And I will not raise him in a home built on lies. You have a speech to give, Jonathan. I suggest you pull yourself together. You wouldn't want to disappoint your investors. And with that, before he could utter another word, another lie, another empty promise, Amelia Redmond ended the call. She switched her phone to airplane mode, handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, and walked down the jet bridge without looking back. As she stepped onto the plane, she felt the weight of her old life fall away, leaving a terrifying but exhilarating void in its place. She was pregnant, alone, and flying toward an unknown future in a country she'd never been to. But for the first time in a long time, she was free. The flight across the Atlantic was a strange, surreal limbo. Cocooned in the anonymous darkness of the cabin, Amelia didn't sleep. She stared out the window at the endless black ocean, the enormity of her decision washing over her in waves. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her resolve. She was thousands of miles from everything she knew, pregnant and alone with a dwindling bank account and a future that was a complete blank. There were moments of sheer panic where she wanted to demand the plane turn around. But then she would feel the gentle stir of her baby, a tiny, persistent anchor in the storm of her emotions. This wasn't just about her escape. It was about his sanctuary. She was forging a new world for him, one that would be built on truth and strength, not on the glittering facade of the Davenport Empire. She landed at Lisbon's Humberto Delgado Airport as the sun was beginning to cast a pale, rosy glow over the city. The air that greeted her as she stepped out of the terminal was different, softer than New York's, tinged with the faint, briny scent of the nearby Atlantic and the sweet smell of pastries from a nearby cafe. It smelled like a new beginning. Chloe had booked her a room in a modest but clean hotel in the Graça district, one of Lisbon's oldest neighborhoods. After a taxi ride through winding cobblestone streets, past buildings adorned with beautiful intricate tiles, azulejos, she would later learn they were called, she checked in. The room was simple, with a small balcony that overlooked a tangle of terracotta rooftops and the distant, sparkling Tagus River. It was a world away from the sleek, impersonal luxury of her Fifth Avenue penthouse. It was real. The first week was the hardest. Loneliness was a physical ache. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, disoriented, reaching for a husband who was not only absent, but was the very reason for her exile. The pregnancy, once a source of shared joy, was now a solitary journey marked by mourning, sickness, and fatigue that she had to navigate alone in a foreign city. She subsisted on bread, cheese, and fruit from the local mercado, her limited Portuguese making every transaction a small, exhausting challenge. She spoke with her lawyer, Brenda Walsh, over a series of secure video calls. Brenda was exactly the shark Chloe had promised, a brisk, no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. "He's contesting everything, of course," Brenda said in her clipped New York accent, "claiming parental alienation, emotional distress. His legal team is trying to freeze your assets, arguing you absconded with joint funds." "The funds I took were from the account I had before we were married," Amelia stated calmly, having prepared for this. "Good. That helps." Brenda nodded. "Jonathan's primary strategy will be to paint you as an unstable, vindictive runaway. Our strategy will be to paint him as a calculating, adulterous narcissist who created an environment so toxic that his pregnant wife was forced to flee for her own well-being. The truth, in other words. But the truth needs evidence." Amelia spent hours methodically forwarding Brenda every piece of her digital investigation, the emails, the credit card statements, the phone logs, the link to Sophia Dubois's Instagram. She was building a case brick by painful brick. In between the legal battles and the waves of morning sickness, Amelia forced herself to explore. She walked. She walked until her feet ached through the winding alleys of Alfama, listening to the melancholy strains of fado music drifting from open doorways. She rode the iconic yellow tram 28, marveling at the vibrant street life. She sat for hours in sun-drenched prasas, sipping decaf coffee and sketching the architecture in a notebook she'd bought. The city's resilience resonated with her. Lisbon had been devastated by an earthquake in 1755, only to be rebuilt more beautiful and enduring than before. She saw a metaphor for her own life in its tiled facades and sturdy foundations. She too had been shaken to her core. She too would rebuild. It was her sketching that saved her. Drawing the buildings, the archways, the intricate ironwork of the balconies reawakened the architect within her. It was a part of herself she had suppressed, a passion she had set aside for Jonathan. Now it was her therapy. She wasn't just drawing buildings. She was reconnecting with the woman she had been before she became Mrs. Davenport. One afternoon, sitting in a cafe near the Bel Em Tower, she overheard two men at the next table speaking English. They were lamenting the difficulty of finding local architects who understood the aesthetic of international clients looking to renovate historic properties. They either want to gut everything and build a glass box, or they're so preservation-focused you can't even update the plumbing, one of them complained. A spark of an idea ignited within Amelia. She had the training. She understood both the sleek modernism of international taste, and as she was rapidly learning the deep historic soul of Portuguese design, she saw a niche, a tiny crack in the market she might be able to fill. That evening, back in her small hotel room, she didn't cry. Instead, she opened a fresh page in her sketchbook. At the top, she wrote a single word, alma, the Portuguese word for soul. She began to sketch not just buildings, but a future. It was a fragile blueprint, full of uncertainty. But for the first time since landing, it was a design that was entirely her own. The first few months of building a new life from scratch were a grueling testament to Amelia's newfound grit. Her escape fund was finite, and the initial legal fees were draining it faster than she liked. She moved from the hotel to a small rented apartment in the Campo de Urique neighborhood, a charming, family-oriented area with a famous indoor market. It was modest, but it was home. She dedicated her days to a strict regimen. Mornings were for Portuguese lessons online and communicating with Brenda Walsh. Afternoons were for her work. She created a professional portfolio, blending her old projects from New York with new speculative designs for Lisbon renovations she'd conceptualized in her sketchbook. She started a simple website, showcasing her unique vision, a fusion of modern functionality and deep respect for historical character. She named her fledgling one-woman consultancy Alma Designs. Her first client came from a chance encounter at a prenatal yoga class she'd joined to connect with other expectant mothers. A fellow expat, a British woman named Sarah, was complaining about the 19th century apartment she and her husband had bought. It was beautiful but impractical, a maze of dark, tiny rooms. Amelia, her confidence bolstered by weeks of preparation, shyly offered her portfolio. Sarah was impressed. Amelia's designs didn't seek to erase the apartment's history, but to illuminate it. She proposed removing a non-load-bearing wall to create an open-plan living space while restoring the original crown molding and azulejo tiles. She designed custom space-saving storage that was sleekly modern, yet unobtrusive. It was a revelation. The project was small, but Amelia poured her entire being into it. She managed the contractors, navigated the labyrinthine local permit offices, and oversaw every detail, her burgeoning belly a constant presence on the dusty construction site. The result was stunning. Sarah was thrilled and recommended Alma Designs to her network of fellow expats. Slowly, more work started trickling in. A small cafe renovation, a bachelor pad redesign, a family home extension. Her reputation grew by word of mouth. She was the architect who listened, who respected the soul of a space. Her big break came in her 8th month of pregnancy. A man named Javier Rossi, a legendary and semi-retired Portuguese property developer, had heard about her work. He was in his late 60s, with a warm smile and eyes that held the wisdom of a long and successful career. He invited her for coffee. "Your work is very interesting, Ms. Redmond," Javier said, looking through her portfolio. You have a North American sense of space and light, but a European respect for history. It's a rare combination. He owned a derelict former tile factory in the Alcantara district, a sprawling industrial building with vast potential, situated right between the old city and the trendy riverfront. His dream was to convert it into a mixed-use, space luxury, loft apartments, artisan workshops, and a public gallery. Many had tried to pitch him, but he found their plans soulless. "Show me," he said with a wave of his hand. "Show me what Alma Designs would do with it." For 2 weeks, Amelia barely slept. Fueled by a creative fire she hadn't felt in years, she threw herself into the project. She worked from her small apartment, her drafting table littered with sketches, material samples, and baby name books. She envisioned a design that honored the building's industrial past, keeping the exposed brickwork and high ceilings, but infused it with warmth and light. She designed a central plant-filled atrium, sustainable energy systems, and living spaces that flowed. She presented her proposal to Javier, not as a set of blueprints, but as a story. The story of the building's soul being reborn. Javier listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Ms. Redmond," he said finally. A slow smile spreading across his face. "This is not a project for a freelance consultant. This requires a firm, a partner." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a proposal for a new business venture, a partnership between the two of them, with him providing the capital and connections, and her providing the creative vision. He was offering to back the official launch of Alma Designs as a premier boutique architecture firm. Tears welled in Amelia's eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of overwhelming, triumphant joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, absolutely." 2 weeks later, Amelia went into labor. She gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. As she held him in her arms in a Lisbon hospital room, the city lights twinkling outside her window, she looked at his perfect, tiny face and knew his name. Noah. It meant rest and comfort. But to her, it meant a new beginning, a promise kept. The divorce was finalized a month later. Thanks to Brenda Walsh's relentless work and the mountain of evidence, Amelia received a settlement that was far more generous than Jonathan had intended, plus substantial child support. He was granted supervised, pre-arranged video calls with Noah, but his legal attempts to force her return to the US had failed. The court recognized she had established a new life and a thriving business. The years that followed were a whirlwind of growth. Alma Designs became a resounding success. The Alcantara factory project, renamed The Kiln, won prestigious European design awards, putting Amelia on the map. She was no longer Amelia Redmond, the spurned wife. She was Amelia Redmond, the visionary CEO, a titan of industry in her own right. She moved with Noah into one of the stunning lofts she herself had designed, a space filled with light laughter and love. She was a boss, a mother, and the architect of her own destiny. 4 years flew by. Noah was a bright, happy boy, chattering away in a delightful mix of English and Portuguese. Alma Designs had grown into a 20-person firm, handling high-profile projects across Portugal and Spain. Amelia was a respected figure in the European design world, known for her sustainable, soulful approach to architecture. The pain of Jonathan's betrayal had faded from a raw wound to a distant scar, a reminder of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Her contact with Jonathan was minimal and sterile, mediated through lawyers and scheduled video calls. On screen, he was a ghost from her past. He always looked tired, the confident swagger replaced by a strained formality. Amelia kept the calls brief, focusing solely on Noah, never giving him an inch of personal information. She knew from snippets Chloe would pass on from financial news that his star had dimmed. The messy public divorce had tarnished his golden boy image. Several key partners had left his firm, and a few high-risk investments had gone sour. Sophia Dubois had reportedly departed for a competitor in Singapore a year after the scandal broke. The empire Jonathan had prized above all else was showing cracks. Amelia didn't gloat. She simply didn't care. Her world was here in Lisbon with her son, her company, and her friends. One sunny Thursday afternoon, Amelia was in her office at the Kiln, a beautiful light-filled space overlooking the firm's central atrium. Her assistant buzzed through on the intercom. "Amelia, there's a gentleman here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment. He says his name is Jonathan Davenport." The name hit her like a physical shock. Her blood ran cold. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. He was here, in her building, in her city, thousands of miles from where he belonged. "Tell him I'm not available," she said, her voice tight. A moment's pause. "He says he won't leave," her assistant replied, sounding flustered. "He says it's about Noah." The mention of their son was a calculated blow, and she knew it. He was using the one thing that could breach her walls. Fury, hot and familiar, surged through her. "Fine," she said, her voice like ice. "Send him in." She stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, her back to the door, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She needed to be standing to feel the ground beneath her feet. She heard the door open and close. "Amelia." His voice. It was the same voice that had whispered lies and promises in her ear. But it was different now. It lacked the easy confidence, the undertone of absolute power. She turned around, slowly. He looked older than his years. There were fine lines around his eyes she didn't recognize, and a hint of grey at his temples. He was still handsome, still dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, but he seemed diminished like a photograph that had faded in the sun. He was holding a small, brightly wrapped gift. "What are you doing here, Jonathan?" she asked, her tone flat, devoid of any emotion. "I came to see my son," he said, taking a step forward. "And you. You see your son on a screen every second Sunday." That was the arrangement, she countered, not moving an inch. "And you have no business seeing me. He's 4 years old, Amelia. He needs his father, not a face on a laptop," he said, his voice laced with a rehearsed sincerity. "I was wrong. What I did, it was the biggest mistake of my life. I lost everything that mattered." He looked around her office at the awards on the shelf, the stunning view of the city she had conquered. A flicker of something, was it disbelief, envy, crossed his face. "You've done well for yourself," he said, the words sounding hollow. "I have," she agreed simply. "No thanks to you." "That's not fair," he protested, taking another step. "I gave you a world most people can only dream of." Amelia let out a short, bitter laugh. "You gave me a gilded cage, Jonathan, and it turns out the bars were made of lies. I built this world," she said, gesturing around her, "with my own 2 hands while you were trying to tear me down with lawyers." He had the grace to look ashamed. "I was hurt. I was lashing out. I see that. Now, Sophia is gone. My business has suffered. I've had a lot of time to think about you, about us, about what we threw away." He held up the gift. "This is for Noah. I was hoping I could give it to him myself, maybe take him to the park, and then you and I could have dinner. Talk for real this time. It was a classic Jonathan maneuver. The appeal to emotion, the feigned remorse, the strategic use of their child, all wrapped up in a package of charm he assumed was still irresistible. But he wasn't dealing with the same woman. He wasn't talking to the trusting, naive wife he had cheated on. He was talking to the CEO of Alma Designs. She looked him dead in the eye, her gaze unflinching. "Let me be perfectly clear," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You are not taking my son anywhere. You will not see him outside of your scheduled calls. And you and I will never, ever be having dinner." He was stunned into silence, clearly not expecting such a swift, absolute rejection. The charming smile faltered. "Amelia, be reasonable." "No, Jonathan, you be reasonable," she cut in her voice, rising with controlled power. "You flew 3,000 miles unannounced to ambush me at my place of work, using our son as bait, because your life fell apart, and you've decided you want your old one back. You think you can walk in here and erase the past. You think I'm just waiting to be reclaimed." She walked towards him, stopping just feet away. "That life is gone. The woman you were married to is gone. I buried her the day I boarded that flight. You don't get to come here and dig up her grave." His face hardened, the mask of contrition falling away to reveal the familiar, arrogant man beneath. "You owe me, Amelia. You took my son away from me." "I saved my son from you," she shot back. "From your lies, your selfishness, your utter lack of integrity. He has a wonderful life here. He is happy and he is loved. That is all that matters." She pointed to the door. "You can leave the gift with my assistant if you like. She'll make sure he gets it. Now get out of my office, get out of my building, and get out of my city." For a long moment they stood locked in a standoff, the past and present colliding in the sunlit office. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and perhaps for the first time he saw not the woman he had lost, but the powerhouse she had become. He saw that he had no power here. Defeated, he placed the gift on her desk, turned without another word, and walked out of her life for the second time. As the door closed behind him, Amelia didn't feel relief or triumph. She felt nothing at all. He was just an echo from a past that no longer had the power to hurt her. After the heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing Jonathan's presence out of her world, Amelia didn't move. She remained at the window, her back to the room, her gaze fixed on the bustling courtyard below. The silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was full of her own strength, a quiet, humming power that filled the space he had tried to invade. There was no grief, no lingering what-if, not even the satisfying fire of victory. There was only the calm, steady assurance of a foundation that had been tested and had held. He was a ghost from a demolished building, and she now lived in a skyscraper of her own design. She checked the time. 3:45 p.m. She calmly gathered her handbag, smoothed down her dress, and walked out of her office, her expression serene. "Inez," she said to her assistant, who looked at her with wide, curious eyes. "I'm leaving a bit early today. Please handle any calls." She didn't glance at the brightly wrapped gift still sitting on her desk. It was an artifact from a museum she no longer visited. Her drive to Noah's Escola in the Lapa district was a study in contrasts. She navigated the charming, sun-drenched streets, her mind replaying not the confrontation with Jonathan, but the million tiny moments that constituted her real life here. The friendly nod from the man at the corner kiosk, the scent of blooming jacaranda trees, the specific shade of ochre on a favorite building. These were the details of her peace, the textures of her happiness. When she arrived, Noah came barreling out of the school's gate and into her arms, his small body, a warm, solid anchor of pure love. "Mama!" he cried, his chatter a waterfall of Portuguese and English as he described his day. A painting of a giant fish, a new song about a boat. As she buckled him into his car seat, his small hand reached out and patted her cheek. "You're smiling, Mommy." "I am, my love," she said, her heart swelling. "I have a lot to smile about." Instead of going straight home, she took him for a treat. They sat outside their favorite pastelaria, sharing a warm, flaky pastel de nata. She watched him get cinnamon all over his nose, and she laughed a genuine, unburdened laugh. This was her world. Not the empty opulence of New York society, but this small, perfect moment. This was what she had fought for. This was her victory. The conversation with Jonathan had simply been the sweeping up of the last fleck of dust from a long-finished renovation. Later that evening, after Noah was asleep, she finally called Chloe. She sat on her balcony, a glass of crisp Vinho Verde in her hand, the lights of the 25 de Abril bridge twinkling like a diamond necklace against the dark velvet of the night sky. "So the ghost of Christmas past paid a visit," Chloe said, her voice crackling with protective anger. "Do I need to fly to Lisbon and key his rental car?" Amelia laughed again, the sound lighter than it had been in years. "Save the airfare. It's not necessary. It was clarifying, Chloe. For years there was maybe a tiny subconscious part of me that wondered if he'd ever feel remorse, if he'd ever truly understand what he threw away. And today, I got my answer. He doesn't. He doesn't regret losing me. He regrets losing the perfect accessory, the stable home life that made his empire building easier. He regrets the consequences to his own life. Seeing him just confirmed that the man I loved never actually existed. "So you're really okay?" Chloe asked, her voice softening. "I'm better than okay," Amelia affirmed, taking a sip of wine. "I feel free, like the last chain just rusted away. He has no power here, Chloe. This is my city. He was just a tourist." In the year that followed, Amelia's life didn't just continue, it bloomed. Alma Designs landed its most ambitious project. Yet the transformation of a sprawling, neglected wine estate in the Douro Valley into a world-class, sustainable luxury hotel and retreat, the Quinta da Luz. The project was immensely complex, involving historical restoration, cutting-edge ecological technology, and navigating a web of local traditions. It consumed her, but in the best possible way. She thrived on the challenge, leading her growing team with a vision that was both bold and empathetic. Javier Rossi, seeing her masterful handling of the project, formally dissolved their initial partnership and restructured the firm, making her the majority owner and managing partner. He was, he said, ready to enjoy his retirement and watch her soar. Her personal life also found a new, gentle rhythm. She wasn't actively seeking romance, but she was no longer closed off to it. She cultivated a warm circle of friends, other parents from Noah's school, fellow artists and entrepreneurs from the kiln. There was a handsome landscape architect, Miguel, who worked with her on the Quinta da Luz project. Their conversations started with soil acidity and native plants, but soon drifted to art travel and single parenthood. It was easy, unforced. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was the slow, steady building of a new connection based on mutual respect and shared laughter. It was healthy. Exactly a year after Jonathan's visit, Chloe came to Lisbon. Amelia took her on a tour, a journey through her own history. They stood outside the first modest hotel in Graça. "This is where I landed," Amelia said quietly, pregnant, terrified, and with about enough money for a month. Then they went to the Kiln, her bustling, award-winning headquarters. They walked through the light-filled atrium employees, greeting Amelia with warmth and respect. "And this is where I am now," she said, a proud smile on her face. That night, sitting on the balcony that had once been her solitary refuge, Chloe raised her glass. "To Amelia Redmond," she toasted. "She came, she saw, she built the damn thing herself." A few months later, Amelia was in a grand historic hall in Berlin, the air electric with anticipation. She was there to accept the prestigious European Woman in Architecture Award. When her name was called, the applause was deafening. As she walked to the stage, the spotlight warm on her face, she felt the weight of her journey. Every tear, every fear, every sleepless night, every small victory. She looked out at the sea of faces and began her speech. She spoke of how buildings have a soul, an alma. She talked about the beauty of restoration, of taking something broken or forgotten and revealing its true character, making it stronger and more luminous than before. "We often think of foundations as being made of concrete and steel," she said, her voice resonating with quiet confidence. "But the strongest foundations are intangible. They are integrity, resilience, and the courage to demolish a life that is not true, to build one that is. My greatest project has not been a hotel or a loft. It has been building a life of honesty for my son and rediscovering the woman I was meant to be." She paused, then concluded, "This award is for my team, for my mentors, and for my son Noah, who is my true north. And it's for the beautiful, resilient city of Lisbon, which taught me that even after the most devastating earthquake, you can rebuild and you can reach for the sky once more." The standing ovation was long and heartfelt. Back in her Lisbon loft, the heavy, elegant award sitting on the mantelpiece, she found Noah on the floor, not with blocks, but with a miniature architectural model of the Quinta da Luz project. He was carefully placing tiny model trees around the main building. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with pride. "You build big, beautiful houses, Mummy." "We do, my love," she said, kneeling down beside him and pulling him into a hug, inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of her son, her home, her entire world. She held him tight, her chin resting on his head as she looked out the window at the familiar skyline. The frightened woman who had landed at JFK with nothing but a secret and a prayer was gone forever. The heartbroken wife who had cried over a stranger's email was a phantom. In their place stood this woman here now. A mother, a visionary, the CEO of a company built on soul. She was not just the queen of a kingdom she had inherited. She was the architect, engineer, and master builder of her own life, and from this vantage point, the view was magnificent. And that is Amelia's incredible journey. From the hollow glamour of a Fifth Avenue penthouse to the authentic sun-drenched streets of Lisbon, her story is a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit. She transformed the deepest betrayal into the foundation for a new life, proving that our greatest heartbreaks can often become the catalyst for our most profound triumphs. She didn't just escape her past, she redesigned her future. What did you think of her final confrontation with Jonathan? Was she right to completely shut him out of her and Noah's life? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If Amelia's story of resilience and empowerment inspired you, please smash that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to become the architect of your own destiny. And for more real-life stories of drama, revenge, and ultimate victory, make sure you hit subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for listening.